So I saw this video about how anyone can acquire any difficult language and reach a pretty conversational level. So I did some research, and the reason why Jeff Brown, the person who acquired Arabic, was able to achieve this level of Arabic in only 1 year is because he used a method based on research that explains how we acquire language, which is different than learning a language. Now this research is also known as second language acquisition theory by Dr. Stephen Krashen, and after reading it, it just made so much sense. And in this video, I'm going to tell you why learning a language is basically useless, how we actually acquire any language, how speaking and speaking too early can be harmful, and what optimal input looks like. All of this is based off a theory and a hypothesis, but in my personal experience and opinion, this is extremely accurate. There's basically two ways to gain competence in any language. First, there's acquisition, and I quote, "The first way is language acquisition, a process similar, if not identical, to the way children develop ability in their first language. Language acquisition is a subconscious process. Language acquirers are not usually aware of the fact that they are acquiring language, but are only aware of the fact that they are using the language for communication. The result of language acquisition, acquired competence, is also subconscious. We are generally not consciously aware of the rules of the languages we have acquired. Instead, we have a feel for correctness. Grammatical sentences sound right or feel right, and errors feel wrong, even if we do not consciously know what rule was violated." Now, on the other hand, there's learning. And I quote, "The second way to develop competence in a second language is by language learning. We will use the term learning henceforth to refer to conscious knowledge of a second language, knowing the rules, being aware of them, and being able to talk about them. In non-technical terms, learning is knowing about a language, known to most people as grammar or rules. Normally, acquisition initiates our utterances in a second language and is responsible for our fluency. Learning has only one function, and that is as a monitor or editor. Learning comes into play only to make changes in the form of our utterance after it has been produced by the acquired system. This can happen before we speak or write, or after self-correction." And I feel this is very accurate, because when I think about how I learned Japanese, for example, all I did was learn grammar at first. After that, I was able to understand a few things, but those were usually examples and things that contained the grammar that I had learned, but I could really not form any sentences by myself. Now, I did try to speak Japanese a while ago and more recently as well, and I noticed that I think a lot. Like I think all the time when I try to speak, because I want my sentence to be correct. And that is not fluency, because as I just said, fluency is not having to think. Now, one of the hypotheses in this theory is called the monitor hypothesis, and there's basically three kind of monitor users. Now, one of them is called a monitor overuser, and I think I am one of them. Here's a description. Let's see if you are one of those people as well. "These are people who attempt to monitor all the time, performers who are constantly checking the output with their conscious knowledge of the second language. As a result, such performers may speak hesitantly, often self-correct in the middle of utterances, and are so concerned with correctness that they cannot speak with any real fluency." Now, my opinion on this hypothesis is that it's extremely accurate. So if learning, and learning grammar in particular, only serves as a monitor, then how do we actually acquire language? How do we acquire language? And I quote, "How do we move from stage I, where I represents current competence, to I+1, the next level? We acquire only when we understand language that contains structure that is a little beyond where we are now. How is this possible? How can we understand language that contains structures that we have not yet acquired? The answer to this apparent paradox is that we use more than our linguistic competence to help us understand. We also use context, our knowledge of the world, our extra linguistic information to help us understand language directed at us. Our assumption has been that we first learn structures, then practice using them in communication, and this is how fluency develops." The input hypothesis says the opposite. It says we acquire by going for meaning first, and as a result, we acquire structure. When communication is successful, when the input is understood and there is enough of it, I+1 will be provided automatically. So when there's language directed at us and we understand the message of that language, that's when we acquire the language. Now, in order to acquire new language, there should be I+1. So I is what you already know, and then +1 is something new. And that something new is understood by context. So basically it says that by having lots of comprehensible input, we can acquire language, which is funny because a lot of people focus on speaking as well, and actually this document says that speaking can be harmful if you do it too early. What's also important is that the ability to produce emerges automatically and can be taught. The ability to speak the language emerges after you've acquired it unconsciously. Because as a matter of fact, if you speak too early or you ask people to speak, When they're not ready, they become anxious and nervous. And this is actually pretty interesting because there's this other hypothesis called the affective filter hypothesis, which states that the amount of self-confidence, motivation, and anxiety actually affect the language acquisition process. And here's actually a picture of that. So you can see that when there's input, first it goes through this filter. Now, if you have a lot of anxiety, no motivation, or low confidence, that means that your filter is really strong and not a lot of the inputs can actually reach your language acquisition device, which is basically your ability to acquire language, which everyone has. Now, what I personally found really interesting is that there was a study with a boy who had congenital dysarthria. This is a disorder, so he couldn't speak, basically. He was still able to understand spoken English perfectly. In other words, he was able to acquire English without ever producing or without outputting the language. Now, speaking does help in a way that they can direct a conversation. For example, if you don't understand something, then you can speak and ask your whoever's talking to you to change the way that they speak so that you can change the input, the quality of the input, so that it becomes more comprehensible for you and you understand it better. So if comprehensible input is the way to go, then what does optimal input look like? Well, first of all, it should be comprehensible, of course. And there's a funny example in this article. If you have an English speaker and you let him watch an hour of Polish TV, then he won't understand anything after that hour, or I should say he won't have acquired any Polish in that hour, simply because all of that input isn't comprehensible at all. The input should also be interesting and relevant. And ideally, you want to have input where you even forget that you're speaking in or listening to another language. Optimal input should not be grammatically sequenced. Now, at school, when you learn grammar, usually you learn grammar in a certain order, and that order makes sense because teachers think that is the logical way to learn certain things. But actually, this study shows that the order that most people teach language grammar in is different than the order that we acquire natural language. And also in school, when they teach you grammar, the teacher usually assumes that everyone is getting the same I+1, which is not really the case because, as seen before, it depends per person on their affective filter. Some people might be born more nervous or might have lower motivation, so it's different per person. Now, with natural different input as opposed to grammar sequence input, there's a lot of variety in the input, and there will be enough I+1 for everyone. And finally, optimal input must be in sufficient quantity. Now, it's difficult to say how much of input you really need in terms of hours before you reach a certain level of fluency, but there's this website from the FSI, Foreign Service Institute, I think, and they have this chart which shows all these languages and the amount of hours that are required to reach certain levels. However, these hours are hours with the language when taught traditionally. So I guess if done with comprehensible input, then the amount of hours should be less, right? And if you look at Arabic, it actually says 2200. So now to go back, how did Jeff Brown learn Arabic or acquire Arabic using all of this theory with his method? Now I'll explain that in the next video, so when that is done you can see that here, and I'll see you there.